Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel. We check out great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, grand unified theories, magnum opuses, tour de forces, earth-shattering discoveries, mostly from obscure sources. And we also look at things like the Bible Decode. Today is number 229. And, the Bible is not an obscure source, but the interpretations that we're going over are obscure. And we've been less obscure than they were 25 years ago, but emerging. But things that you can hold, things that you can believe in, things that will impact your life in profound ways. And we've been looking at the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. That is, that the Romans wrote the New Testament, not the apostles of Jesus. It was a psychological operation, or psyop, instituted by the Romans against the Jews. They had just gotten done fighting the Jews in a war, which was the culmination of a bunch of revolutions and insurrections and uprisings and revolts and riots and terrorist attacks from the Jews over the last 130 years since the Romans took over in Judea. And the Romans were tired of trying to deal with the Jews, their militancy, their aggressiveness, of all the people that were in the Roman Empire. The Jews were the most difficult to deal with. And so after this war was over, the emperors, Emperor Vespasian, or the Caesars, Vespasian and his son Titus, who eventually became emperor as well, they were both veterans of this war. They fought as generals in the war, and they were both wounded in the war. And so that also probably created some of their motive. More probably incidentally, Titus was particularly frustrated with the Jews because he could not get them to show fealty or any type of obedience or allegiance to Titus. They would rather die first. And so they concocted this story of the Gospels. They knew that the Jews were waiting for a Messiah, literally, from their Old Testament prophecies, and that this Messiah was a military commander who was going to help the Jews overthrow the Romans. And that literally happened in this war, where some self-proclaimed Jewish messiahs did rise up, and they kicked out the Herod client kings of Rome from Jerusalem in 66 AD. Sending, his name was Herod Agrippa II, and he was sent back to Rome. And then that caused Emperor Nero to send in the army led by General Vespasian. And that war took 7 years to resolve. The first 3+ years under Vespasian, and then he became the new emperor after Nero and 3 other emperors were assassinated. And then eventually he gave over the military reins to his son Titus. And so they wrote this story of the Gospels. They backdated the story by 40+ years. And then at the same time, and so the story is not about a Jewish Messiah that was going to lead them into battle against the Romans, but instead it was about a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace, and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, to walk an extra mile with the Roman soldiers, heavy bags, heavy backpacks, and to turn the other cheek to oppression. Jesus invariably, you can't find anything in the Gospels where Jesus goes against the Romans, but you can find many things in the Gospels where Jesus goes against the Jews. In particular, overturning the tables of the Jewish money changers who were changing out the Roman money, which was blasphemous because it had graven images on it, for the kosher Jewish money, so that it could be used for offerings or for buying sacrificial animals, which Jesus also berated those Jewish merchants who were selling small animals for the animal sacrifice in the temple. So Jesus is attacking the Jews, but being utterly deferential to the Romans. And then if you get past the Gospels and you get into the epistles of Paul, you find that Paul is even more pro-Roman and anti-Jew than Jesus was. Almost as if the whole thing was concocted by the Romans themselves. But that is just speculation. The real evidence arises when you look at the motive, the means. The Romans were the only people who had the means and the opportunity to do this, basically with all of their wealth and all of the, mind power that they had at the court there, and all of the learning in both Old Testament understanding from the Herods and the Alexanders and the Queen Berenike, and then also the opportunity, because the Romans had a monopoly over censorship, publishing, and distribution. So they were the only people that could have written it, really. It was written in Greek, which is one of the two languages in currency at Rome. Not so much in Judea, where they would have been speaking in Aramaic, and they were all mostly illiterate, but that's what they would have been writing in. Also, Greek was much more rare in Judea than in Rome. And the MO, method of operation, the Romans had created a number of other religions that are documented in the first century, as well as Christianity, for psychological operation purposes. But the evidence, that's really circumstantial evidence. The real evidence comes from looking at the text, the scripture, at the same time that you looked at another work that the Romans wrote at the same time that is called War of the Jews, which is a history of the 7-year-long war from 66 to 73 AD. And they wrote this under the name of Josephus, or Josephus. And Josephus, in his own autobiography, claims to have been a denizen of the Roman court, one of the court historians, living at Caesar's palace in a townhouse granted to him by Emperor Vespasian, when Vespasian adopted him as a member of his family, such that he is known as Flavius Josephus. And so we know Josephus is an agent of the Romans, but when we read his books, we find out that whoever he was, whether he's a real person or a team of people or just a pseudonym or whatever he is also the author of the Gospels. Because the parallels between the two books are stunning and far beyond any type of coincidental possibility. Michael Menescot's, in his book Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult, detected over 250 parallels between the two books just in the book of Luke. Meaning that the book of Luke is literally saturated with parallels, like a dozen per page minimum. And and some of the parallels last for a while, where they go over a number of different commonalities of themes. They're various themes, they're various families of parallels, and some of them are very, very detailed, intricate, and incredibly well hidden. They put a great deal of thought into this. And when you do actually kind of decode them, many of them are literally dripping with hate for the Jews. Ridicule, mockery, demeaning, degrading the Jews at every chance that they could get. Not only the Jews, but anybody who believes in their text, their Gospels. Then Michael Menescot's actually graphed all of the parallels that he found. He put the book of Luke on the vertical axis, War of the Jews on the horizontal axis, and plotted a point every place that there was a parallel, to find that he had crafted 5 almost perfect letters in Latin, which is the other language of the Roman Caesars. Most of the Roman royals were bilingual. And what that basically means is not only did the Romans write the book of Luke, but they signed their names to it. APTVS. AP is up for some debate. TV would be Titus Vespasian. And I'm not sure about the S either. But there are many other themes involved. Joseph Atwill, in his 2005 book, Caesar's Messiah, found that the ministry of Jesus in Judea, as depicted in the book of Luke, is identical to the military campaign of Titus in Judea, exactly 40 years later. Every place that Titus goes, Jesus also goes, in the same order, and they both participate in parallel events at each location that are spaced out by 40 years, sometimes to the hour. And we're not just talking about a few events, we're talking about over 40 separate events that are parallel in the two books. Many of the prophecies that Jesus makes in the New Testament are fulfilled in the pages of the War of the Jews. Most importantly is the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem, which Jesus says is a marking of his second coming. And that prophecy was fulfilled by Titus, making Titus the second coming of Jesus. The Romans literally grafted themselves onto the Jewish lineage. You know, all the way, how many ever 70 generations or whatever, all the way from Adam to Seth to, I can't remember the third one, Enoch and Noah and Abraham and Moses and David and Solomon, and all the way down to Jesus and then to Titus. Titus is the culmination of the lineage of the Jewish patriarchs. in the as written in the War of the Jews. Now, we're looking at a book here which kind of scratches the surface of the Roman origins hypothesis, meaning that they recognize how blatantly Paul is anti-Jew and pro-Roman, and how could that possibly be? How could it possibly be like that? But they don't really detect that the same is true of Jesus in the Gospels. And I know it's true to a lesser degree in Jesus' case, and maybe that's why they don't detect it, and maybe they're just not really suspecting this. So as a result, they argue that Paul is a Roman intelligence agent, that Paul is a spy for the Romans, and his whole shtick about his conversion on the road to Damascus was a false flag operation in order to kind of give him the position so he could infiltrate the followers of Jesus, the Nazarenes under Peter and James, the brother of Jesus. And so that's the kind of the thesis here. This is a book called Operation Messiah by Thies Voskuilen and Rosemary Sheldon. And we are starting a section that is talking about at Jerusalem. So this is when Paul goes to Jerusalem. They say approximately 56 AD, 57 AD. I would dispute the date, but that gets into a whole nother area. This is mostly coming from Acts 21, 15 through 25. Acts devotes no fewer than 8 chapters to the visit and trial of Paul in Jerusalem that supposedly occurred next. Acts stresses how dangerous the projected trip to Jerusalem was by creating an appropriately threatening ambiance in the narrative about the events leading up to the trip. The Jews once again foment a plot against Paul that obliged him to modify his planned route. Instead of sailing to Syria from Greece, he took a more circuitous route overland by Macedonia. At Tyre, Paul and his party stayed with unspecified local helpers who warned him not to go to Jerusalem because of the perils that awaited him there. Why did Paul come to Jerusalem at this time? Acts 11:30 through 12:24 states that Barnabas and Paul went to Jerusalem to deliver a collection. This was the donation Paul had allegedly promised at the first Jerusalem conference. Acts says it was taken up as a result of the prophecy of Agabus, who predicted that a famine would spread over the whole empire. There is also the possibility that Paul may have been summoned to Jerusalem for both religious and political reasons, and that he had political motives for donating the money. This donation may have been used as a pretext for an approach to the movement and an attempt to ingratiate himself. The money may have come from exemplary but naive Christians, but it also could have come from somewhere else. Paul's real employers may have provided the funds as seed money to further their strategic goals. This would not be a unique strategy from an intelligence point of view. The Nazarenes were incensed at reports of Paul's strange and inaccurate teachings about Jesus. Paul had both much to gain and much to lose by going to Jerusalem. He could do what he had done at the last Jerusalem Council, gain a compromise solution by which he could avoid blowing his cover and losing his contacts in Jerusalem. If the worst occurred and he was exposed or expelled, he could play his trump card and announce his Roman citizenship. By invoking the protection of the Roman authorities, he could hope to escape from Jerusalem unharmed, but this would destroy his career as an ersatz Nazarene. Paul's last trip in the east had ended with visits to Miletus, Kos, Rhodes, and Patara, and before he arrived in the Roman capital Caesarea, According to Acts 21, 1 through 8, he stayed at the house of Philip, the evangelist, for several days. Paul then set off for Jerusalem, even though he was warned twice about the danger that awaited him there. We must remember that it was the 50s AD, just a decade before the outbreak of the Great Jewish Revolt. The Sicarii were assassinating Jewish quislings, and zealots were squirming under the yoke of Roman rule. The city was not a safe place for Roman collaborators. When Paul consented to make a public demonstration of loyalty to Torah in the temple, he may have hoped that this would be the end of opposition toward him on the part of the Nazarenes, who, like their leader James, were loyal adherents of the Torah. Considering the events that were to follow, it seems equally possible that he came to Jerusalem with the intent of provoking a disturbance. And this section is called Paul in the Temple and the Riot, Acts 21, 26 to 36. Once in Jerusalem, Paul visited James, and soon afterwards he went to the temple with 4, quote, converts. They might have acted as guards for Paul, as had his accomplices in Damascus. Paul was too well known and had too many enemies among the Jews for his presence to go unnoticed in the temple at festival time. He was recognized by Jews from the province of Asia Minor while he was in the temple, and they raised a riot against him, from which he was lucky enough to escape with his life. The incident is described in Acts 21, 27 to 31. But who were these Jews from Asia Minor? And why were they so violently opposed to Paul? Probably because they knew of him and were familiar with his new message. Paul may have thought he was fooling people when he said, "To Jews I became a Jew to win to Jews I became a Jew to win Jews. As they are subject to the law of Moses, I put myself under the law to win them, although I myself am not subject to it," which is from 1 Corinthians 9:20. His real message, however, was known to a few, and the disclaimer, quote, "God knows I'm not lying," may not have been enough to end the suspicion against him. To his Gentile converts, Paul revealed that he regarded the Torah as obsolete. He may have revealed this also to some Jewish converts when he considered that their progress in understanding had reached such a level that they would be receptive to his anti-Torah teaching. Saying that the Torah was obsolete is not anti-Torah teaching. So that's a little bit of a stretch there. It's like non-Torah teaching, but not anti-Torah. Paul's real interest comes out in his epistles to his Gentile converts. He expresses his view that salvation does not come from observance of the Torah. When the news of his abandonment of the Torah became known to the Jesus movement, it caused such anxiety that Nazarene emissaries were sent out to combat his teaching. Paul himself was summoned twice to Jerusalem to answer charges before the Supreme Tribunal in Jerusalem. Even Acts cannot cover up this fact. In Acts, the Asian Jews say, quote, "This is the man who teaches all men everywhere against our people and our law and this place. And besides, he has brought Greeks into the temple area and defiled this holy place." Now, usually when they use the word Greeks, it's more of a broad term, meaning basically Gentiles. Could be Romans as well. Anyway, that's Acts 21:28. There is a good probability, therefore, that the Asian Jews who dragged Paul out of the temple and denounced him to their fellow Jews as an opponent of the Torah, Israel and the temple, were in fact Nazarenes who had been in conflict with Paul in his Eastern missionary activities, in Galatia, for example. It was because of the possible violence of these observant Jews that James, according to Acts, had already given Paul a warning. The last portion of this passage reads, quote, "They will certainly hear that you have come." James is warning Paul that there may be mob violence. Whether James really warned Paul or whether the author of Acts invented this passage to make it seem as if Paul was accepted by James is unclear. In fact, Paul did not join the original movement, but may have effectively worked to provoke and divide it. From the Messianist perspective, Paul was creating a lot of unrest within the movement, which frequently caused violence and drew unruly crowds. Why would James support a man who both misinterpreted Jesus and brought too much attention to a movement trying to keep a low profile? Moreover, it is remarkable that Paul, allegedly a Messianist leader, would have to be warned about opposition from within the movement, not from authorities. The people from whom Paul had to fear the most violence were those in touch with the Nazarenes of the diaspora, who were familiar with Paul's real personality and teachings, not the facade he presented when visiting Jerusalem. Naturally, they regarded Paul with hostility. Some of these Nazarenes belonged to the extreme wing of the movement, and they had participated in the resistance against the Roman occupation. Such activists, who in many ways had much in common with the Zealot party founded by Judas of Galilee, would be more than likely to resort to violence against someone like Paul, who was reported to have given up Jewish patriotism as well as a reverence for the Torah, and was actively furthering the Roman cause. If Paul had any known Roman associations, this would put him in danger immediately. Why has the author of Acts disguised this matter by representing the people who attacked Paul, dragged him out of the temple, and beat him and called for his execution as Jews and not as Nazarenes? As always, the author of Acts wishes to minimize the opposition to Paul within the Jerusalem movement, the same movement to which he always attributes Pauline doctrines. This section is called Paul Rescued by the Romans. After the attack by Jews from Asia Minor, Paul was rescued by none other than the Roman police, who Acts claims had some difficulty finding out why he had become the center of a disturbance. Acts goes on to say, while they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. He at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Acts portrays Paul's treatment at the hands of his soldier keepers after his Jerusalem arrest as harsh, but being secured by 2 chains was normal police procedure when placing non-Roman citizens under arrest. The Romans gathered vaguely that he was guilty of some offense that had angered the crowd, and so arrested him. This kind of, quote, arrest could have also been a form of protective custody if the Romans wanted the onlookers to believe they were actually arresting Paul, not rescuing him. The tribune's primary responsibility was the maintenance of Roman order in the city, especially in the temple area adjacent to the Antonia. But the arrest also served the purpose of saving Paul from the angry mob. It was not Lysias's job to ascertain the prisoner's identity and learn the exact nature of the charges being made against him. When he queried the denouncers, the rioters could tell him nothing. Acts says, some in the crowd shouted one thing, some another. Since Lysias could not learn the facts this way, he ordered Paul to be brought back to the barracks, allegedly to be examined by torture. In Paul's case, getting the prisoner to the barracks was difficult because of the mob. Acts claims that when he came to the steps, Paul was actually carried by the soldiers on account of the violence of the crowd. We are not told whether Paul sustained any injuries. What is strange is that Paul not only had the opportunity for dialogue with the tribune, but he also had the presence of mind to address an angry crowd. And moreover, he was allowed to address an angry crowd. What kind of a prisoner gives a speech to a crowd? You think the guards are just going to let him talk? I mean, if this was a real story, obviously it's fiction. Anyway, according to Acts, the Roman tribune asked Paul whether he spoke Greek and if he was the Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 men of the assassins, or Sicarii. Notice that in the account, the first thing the Romans try to ascertain is whether he is a Jewish fanatic and nationalist. The tribune's